Hey, my name's Steven, and today I'm going to be showing you how I made this full CG recreation of a shot from a movie I really like. This is done entirely in Cinema 4D using a little bit of X particles, and it is rendered out in Octane Renderer. Let's start modeling the room by first laying down a plane. This will be our floor. Change the width and height segments down to 1 because we don't really need all that geometry. With the face selected, let's get our loop path cut tool and we'll start cutting in these edges for the walls on either side. Now if we select both of these faces for the walls and extrude them upwards, we can start getting an idea of the scale of the room. So to get a better idea of the scale of the room, we can also put in a figure. This guy will help us figure out how things should be in relation to the size of a human being. Throw in a cube to be a placeholder for his couch. We're just gonna put in a bunch of placeholders first. You might have to dip into object mode and select our walls and floor object. We could adjust the scale of it as we move along with this rough sketch of the layout of the room. We'll pop in a couple cubes to act as the TV and the little table that it's standing on. So as we move along, you're going to see me kind of moving things around, adjusting the wall height and sort of the scale of the room. This is something that you really kind of have to beat out as you go. Now to add in a ceiling, what I'm going to do is use my loop path cut tool again, and I'm going to cut a little section at the top of either of these walls. I'll select this new face and extrude it out. Now this will be our wall. So what we're going to want to do is stitch these things together so there aren't any weird sort of overlapping geometry and kind of breaks in our geometry. That's fine if you can't really see these things, but since we're going to be putting in a daylight object, we don't want there to be accidental light spills. So the way you do this is you select the vertices that you want to connect and you choose your stitch and sew tool. You select the vertices that you want to stitch together and you drag your first vertice over to the vertice you want it to stitch to. Now we can do this for all 4 of these points. I add in an Octane camera now so I can start roughly lining up what the shot might look like. Hitting Shift-C will bring up your quick start menu so you can type in a new view panel. This will let us keep our current Octane camera view and be able to freely move around at the same time. For the front wall that we're going to be looking at, I'll create a new cube. I want this to be a completely separate piece of geometry because we're going to be destroying it later on. And just like our floor and first 2 walls, I'm going to limit our cube geometry to 1 face per side. Then we'll use the loop path cut tool to start cutting in where our windows and where our door will be. You can use the inner extrude to keep a nice frame or outline of windows and doors. And then use extrude to push the windows inward and making sure that they don't overlap with the surface behind them. I throw in this cylinder so we could start getting an idea of where the ceiling fan is going to be. And then I start breaking up the left-hand wall to put in a window. Again, just using the single face and cutting it up with the loop path tool. There's this weird little like jar thing with a tube around it in the foreground. So I pop in this cylinder as a placeholder. Then I get a rough model of the TV done. It doesn't need to be too detailed because it's going to be out of focus in the background, just like the reference shot is. And the same thing with the little table that it's on. Again, it's going to be in the background, it's going to be out of focus, so it could be a really basic low poly mesh. And for this couch, I just get a bunch of cubes together and again kind of bang out the sort of rough geometry of it. I know that in the end I could just throw these into a subdivision surface, which will give it the rounded off shape the actual car seat couch thing has. So when I finally do put it in the subdivision surface, all the geometry is too low poly and it ends up making these sort of little smooth stone looking things. All you have to do to fix that is subdivide the original geometry a little bit. With those extra surfaces, the geometry can get closer to the shape that we want here. I just touch up that little weird jar thing here. And for the tube resting on top of it, I make a helix spline and I throw that into a sweep NURBS with a circle spline. Initially the circle's gigantic, so I just have to lower the radius and this will give us our tube. There's a doorway or a closet of some sort on the right hand wall, so I beat out a rough geometry for that as well. So for this door, I want to be able to kick the door down in one solid piece and not break it up with the rest of the wall that it's currently attached to. So I select the face that I want to create a door out of, and I right click and hit split. So this will make a separate piece of geometry, and at this point it's just a single plane. It's a one-faced plane. And from the geometry that I detached it from, I could just delete that piece. Now we have two separate pieces here, and I can start working with that face to make it into a more fully fleshed out door. Because of where I got it from, it'll sort of maintain that position, and it'll be perfectly where our door needs to be. And the door is just made out of inner extrudes and extruding and kind of loop path cut to put some of those indentations around the face of the door. And then the doorknob is just a sphere that I kind of let float out right in front of it, and I attach it as a child of the door object. So the ceiling fan is just a bunch of cylinders for these lights, and all I do is just duplicate it a couple times and rotate it so they're pointing in different directions. And so for the ceiling fan, I made a cube and made it just a basic flat sort of rectangle shape, almost like a plank. Then I just made one side of the plank a little wider. So I hop over here, create an array, pop the cube into the array, lower the amount of copies to 5, and lower the radius, and I just kind of realign where they should be. So I pop into the top view to begin making these curtains. Using the pen sketch tool, I can kind of draw out the ruffled up wiggle that will be our curtains. Initially, the stroke smoothing was set to 50%, which was a little too smooth. I wanted more wrinkles in the curtain, so I set it all the way to 100%, zoomed in a little, and made a bit of more effort to put in those wrinkles. Deleted those original vertices from the wrinkles that I didn't want, and then duplicated this spline. So with two of the same spline, I could pop them both into a loft NURBS and then just raise one up. Raising it up will now give us the basic shape of our curtains. Do a little bit of tweaking by bringing in the top part a little closer so they're scrunched up at the top. Right click on the loft and then hit current state to object. This will give us an actual editable mesh that we're going to want to add dynamics to. And since we're going to be adding dynamics, we're going to want to select the entire mesh so all of our faces are highlighted, and then right click and hit subdivide. Doing that once should give us enough faces and resolution for our simulation to behave a little bit more correctly and accurately. So let's select our mesh, go to X particles cloth, create cloth. We're going to want to select the top row vertices of our curtains, go to select set selection. That'll create a selection tag of points that we'll use to help the curtains stay up. In the X particles cloth tag on our curtain mesh, if you go to the advanced section, we're going to activate pin and drag our selection tag into its box. So if you hit play, our simulation will run and we'll be able to see how our curtains are behaving. So one thing I noticed is that the curtains are going to be overlapping with the jar that is sitting at the foot of them. We don't want that to happen. So what we'll do is we'll go to our jar, right click, and go to X particles and put a collider tag. Now when we run our simulation, our curtains will sort of fold around our jar. And with this done, we can now go to the cloth section of our tag and hit set initial state. This means that we don't have to run through the entire simulation for the curtains to end up in that position. They will just begin that way. The reference for this scene is in a 2:3:5:1 aspect ratio. So I open up our render settings and I put in 2:3:5 for the aspect. So if we hit render on our Octane live viewer, we can start getting a better idea of what the final shot is going to look like. For the window to our left, I'm going to select a face and set selection so I can apply a material to only that face. And the material I'm going to create is going to come from an Octane diffuse material. In the material, I'll go to the emissions, go to black body emission, I'll activate surface brightness. To light the rest of the scene, I'm going to use an Octane daylight, which can be found in objects, lights, Octane daylight. I'll give materials and textures to the rest of the objects in the scene with LiveDB. Go to materials, open LiveDB, and you can just browse around here for all materials and textures that you see fit. When you do find one, you just click on it, and then at the top left-hand corner, you hit download. Now, if you end up downloading a more complicated material, they might include mix objects, which is when you have multiple materials that are being combined into a single one. So when you apply your materials to your scene, make sure that you're using the final stage of that material, which is the mix material. For the little window in the top right and the kind of tall, narrow window next to the door, I downloaded a glass material and I applied it to the single face of these windows. Now here you can see that there's no light coming through them just yet, and that's because on the other side of this mesh there is a polygon face obstructing its view. So I'm going to come around back here and delete these faces, and as soon as I delete these faces you can swing back around and see that there's now light coming through the window. I downloaded a sort of transparent cloth material that I'm going to apply to the curtains, but it wasn't the color that I wanted. So if I open up the material and then go to node editor, inside of the node editor, if I just hop over to this diffuse material, I can change the color. The way a scene looks, regardless of how you light it, can really change depending on the type of rendering methods that you're using. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the first 10 minutes of this lesson. I know it can be really time consuming digging around the internet for very specific tools when you're trying to do a very specific shot or get a very specific effect. And I know there's a lot of filmmakers out there who don't really want to do a deep dive on all this VFX software. So head on over to Gumroad and get the full lesson. For the rest of the lesson, you'll be learning to actually crash through the wall, doing the actual breaking down and getting big pieces and little chunks of rubble and all the dust that kicks up too. And then finally rendering out your scene and understanding things like lighting and motion blur. The full lesson is for $5. So if you're a beginner and can more or less navigate around Cinema 4D, this can teach you how to get some pretty sweet effects in a day's work.